All right, we are about to dive into 10 years of history that didn't just change a country, they completely shattered the old world order and literally built the foundations for the world we live in today. This is the French Revolution, an incredible story of how a nation turned on itself to completely redefine what it means to be free.
So you gotta ask, right? How on earth did three simple words, liberty, equality, fraternity, manage to bring down one of the most powerful thousand-year-old monarchies in Europe? Well, you have to think of France in the 18th century as a giant powder keg, just waiting for a spark. Let's find out what lit the fuse.
Okay, so to understand the explosion, we first have to get the lay of the land. Pre-revolutionary France was built on this incredibly shaky system known as the Ancien regime, or the Old Regime, and it was a system that put every single person into a rigid social box.
And this chart just says it all, doesn't it? You have the first estate, that's the clergy, at just 1% of the population. Then the second estate, the nobility, at a tiny 2%. And then there's everybody else, the third estate. The commoners, the peasants, the merchants made up a whopping 97% of the entire country. Just let that sink in. And this is where it gets really, really unfair. That tiny little 3% minority, the clergy and nobles, they had all the power, all the privileges, just because they were born into the right family. And crucially, they paid almost nothing in taxes. Meanwhile, that massive 97%, yep, they had zero privileges and got stuck paying for everything. The whole system was on their backs.
So with a system this lopsided, you just know it can't last, right? Something has to give. As you can probably guess, the pressure was building, and a few key things were about to come together and light the fuse on that powder keg. It was a total perfect storm. Socially, that 97% was just boiling with resentment. Economically, the country was flat broke from helping out in the American Revolution and other wars, and the price of bread, the main thing people ate, was skyrocketing. Politically, you had King Louis XVI, who was not a strong leader. And maybe most importantly, a revolution of ideas was already sweeping through people's minds. And you know, sometimes an idea is the most powerful weapon of all. Thinkers from the Enlightenment, guys like Rousseau, were challenging the whole idea that kings got their power from God. They were talking about a government that actually represented the people. And suddenly, the masses didn't just have anger, they had a vision for how things could be. So the kingdom is broke, the people are hungry and inspired. The standoff finally reached its breaking point. All that pent-up anger and tension was about to just erupt into open, unstoppable rebellion. And just look how fast things happened in the summer of 1789. On May 5th, the king calls a meeting of the Estates General because he needs to raise taxes. But the Third Estate is done playing by the old rules. By June 20th, they make a radical move and declare themselves the true government, the National Assembly. Then, less than a month later, July 14th, the people of Paris take things into their own hands. Now, the Bastille wasn't just some prison. It was this huge medieval fortress in the middle of Paris that represented the king's terrifying absolute power. So when the mob stormed it, they weren't just after weapons. They were tearing down a symbol of tyranny. This was it. There was no going back. The revolution had begun. Okay, so the old system is shattered. Now what? The revolutionaries had a huge job in front of them, to build a totally new France from the ground up. And they started by laying out the basic principles of what this new nation would believe in. And the document they came up with, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, was, well, it was world-changing. Just listen to these ideas. All men are born free and equal. Everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. Freedom of speech. And get this, the whole point of a government is to protect these rights. This was the blueprint for modern democracy. 2 years later, they turned these ideas into a new constitution. France was no longer an absolute monarchy. It was now a constitutional monarchy, which meant the king's power was checked by an elected assembly. Sounds like a neat and tidy ending, right? Not even close. The story was far from over. See, the revolution's early ideals of liberty were immediately threatened by other kings in Europe who were terrified these ideas would spread, and by enemies inside France. And in the desperate struggle to save their new republic, the revolution took a very, very dark turn. This is when a new, super radical group called the Jacobins takes control.
Their leader was a guy named Maximilien Robespierre, and he was absolutely convinced that the revolution was surrounded by enemies, and that the only way to save it was through extreme, ruthless action.
And what followed was the Reign of Terror. Fueled by paranoia, the Jacobins unleashed a brutal campaign against anyone they even suspected of being an enemy. And the numbers here, they are just chilling. In about a year, there were 17,000 official executions by guillotine. But the total number of deaths, including people who died in prison, was probably closer to 40,000. All it took was a rumor, a suspicion, and you could be next. Well, a society can't survive that level of brutality. The terror became so extreme that the revolutionaries themselves started turning on each other. Eventually, they went after their own leader, and Robespierre himself met his end at the guillotine. That brought the most radical phase to a close, but it left France completely exhausted and unstable. So after the terror, a new 5-man government called the Directory took over, but it was weak, corrupt, and ineffective. This instability created a massive power vacuum, and into that void stepped one of the most brilliant and ambitious military generals in all of history, a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. He would ultimately end the revolution by crowning himself emperor. So after all that, what's the takeaway? The French Revolution absolutely changed the world, period. It destroyed the old system of feudalism and privilege. Its core ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, spread across the entire globe, inspiring one democratic movement after another. It even sparked the first organized calls for women's rights and led to the end of slavery in French colonies. Its echoes are everywhere today.
And that leaves us with a really tough question. The ideals that came out of this revolution are the foundation of modern democracies. But when you look at the bloodshed, at the Reign of Terror, you have to ask, was that the necessary price to pay for liberty? It's a question history is still debating.
If this helped you understand this massive moment in history, please hit that like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more.